Welcome to the UBI Podcast. This is Tyler Prochazka, the features editor for Basic Income Earth Network's Basic Income News. I'm joined today by Dr. Qin Gao of Columbia University, who has recently written a book on the dibao program, which is one of the largest cash transfer welfare programs in the world. And so I'm actually really excited to talk with Dr. Gao today about the program because I've written and done some research on dibao in the past, so I'd love to hear some of her expertise. So, Dr. Gao, it's lovely to have you. And first, could you go through your a little bit about your background and introduce yourself to the listeners?
Thank you very much for having me. So again, my name is Qin Gao. I'm on the faculty of Columbia University School of Social Work. I research about poverty, income inequality, and social welfare programs in China and their international comparisons. My new book is called Welfare, Work, and Poverty, Social Assistance in China. And as you said, it is an evaluation of dibao, how it's been working, how it's been effective or not, and what to do to improve it.
Okay, that's awesome. So, like I mentioned, I've done some research on the dibao in the past, and I'm curious about some very specific aspects that I think are actually really important that might not be as clearly explained in some of the research that I've read. Could you explain when you have the dibao, there's the standard. And so once you reach that standard, presumably you no longer are eligible for the dibao. So can you explain, first of all, what exactly is the withdrawal rate for the dibao? Is it $1 for $1? For each dollar that you make in income, you lose $1 in the dibao?
That's a great question. So let me provide some broad background about the dibao program. It is a typical welfare program. So the local governments set up their local dibao lines, and people would apply for the dibao benefits. If your income is below the dibao line, then you're qualified for the difference, for receiving the difference between your income and the local dibao line, right? So it's an unconditional cash transfer program. Once you receive the benefits, you don't have to follow certain behavior requirements or certain conditions to use the money. So in that case, it's an unconditional cash transfer program. In principle, yes, as you said, if your income is above the dibao line, you would not qualify to get the dibao. Or if your income rises above the dibao line, you would lose your eligibility. However, in reality, many local officials are very considerate of the fluctuation in people's incomes and other family situations, for example, education needs, healthcare needs. So many localities actually have initiatives to not discontinue people's dibao benefits right away if they have income that's higher than the local dibao line. For example, some localities would allow you to stay on dibao for 3 months after you earn some extra income. They want to make sure your job security could sustain so that you are not going to fall back into poverty right away. So there are many local strategies to address that. But in the long term, yes, if you could keep an income level that's above the local dibao line, then your dibao benefits will be taken away.
So how exactly do officials update the dibao benefit for recipients? For example, if you are making above the dibao line, how do they know? Do you have to continually provide updates as a recipient? And if so, do you think that there's somewhat of an incentive to stay below the dibao line? Do you you think there's somewhat of an issue of creating a poverty trap for certain recipients?
Right, that's again a very good question. So dibao requires people to apply every few months, and that varies by locality. So some localities ask you to reapply or recertify your income status every 3 months. Some other localities every 6 months. So that varies. But periodically, you have to basically reapply and then report your income and other family situations. So local officials would gauge your situation and decide again whether you would qualify or not. There's a lot of research about whether people would underreport income and then basically depend on welfare. I think there are two sides to this story. One side is it's true, many dibao recipients do stay on welfare for quite some time. Some probably by choice, but many others not, because they have family members who need health care, or they have children who need to go to school, and that would require more income. So the welfare dependency, or the length people stay on welfare on dibao in this case, could vary from 1 year or 2 years to a few years. At the same time, there's research about the incentive for people to stay on welfare, or the disincentive to work. And research has shown that that's not very strong, that people do not choose to stay on welfare or not work. So there's some evidence, but not a very high likelihood that people would do that.
So how exactly does the new system of applying for the dibao actually work? Do villages still often publish the names, as I've read in other research of potential recipients? I know that it's different in different areas, but in general, how does the system of applying work for the dibao?
Yeah, that is true. So dibao recipients need to apply and then report their income and assets. And then local officials would verify the information, conduct an interview. And then after they do the screening, they would post the preliminary name list in the local community. And then community members, their neighbors, could give feedback about whether they think these people truly qualify or not. And based on that feedback, I think right now many localities also conduct an extra procedure, which is to randomly select some people who qualify and then verify their income information before they are approved. So it's very systematic and stringent process.
Well, it seems like that has the potential to really stigmatize recipients. I mean, commenting on your neighbor's poverty situation, how does that actually change the dynamics of a culture in a village?
Well, that's a challenge, but that currently is the reality. Stigmatization is a theme of welfare and poverty research around the world. In China, partly it's because of the legacy of the socialist regime, that people know about other people's business, and that's widely accepted. At the same time, because dibao is an unconditional cash transfer, so by design, the policy requires applicants to tell the truth, and other community members and neighbors to share the responsibility of monitoring. That is part of the design of this program.
read that in particular areas, for example, in Tianjin, China, they'll have standards where if your child has studied abroad, if you own a computer or a car, or your household is too large, that sort of thing, then they can also cut you off from eligibility for dibao. So in a sense, even though that conditional on paper, they do have standards to determine wealth that are sort of conditions in and of themselves. So I'm curious, how does this work and how do recipients actually respond to those types of standards for receiving the dibao?
Yeah, that is actually true. So in reality, I call these kinds of behavioral tests, it's twofolded. One is an asset test, right? In addition to the income test, the typical means testing. It used to be that if your family have refrigerator or cell phone, you would not qualify to get a dibao. I think now many localities are more lenient on that, especially on the cell phone, but there are certain luxury goods, so-called, that you're not supposed to have. That also feature into the feedback from the neighbors and community members, right? They would get critical and jealous if you have certain luxury goods that they don't have, but you are getting the dibao. They're not. There are also some behavioral standards. For example, dibao recipients in most places are not supposed to have pets. So pets are considered a luxury good. And also, dibao recipients are not supposed to send the kids to expensive private schools.
That leads me to another interesting point that you mentioned, that you wrote in your research, that dibao recipients aren't necessarily spending their cash transfer on long-term investments, such as education, more so on short-term emergency expenditures like medical care. Why is that?
So actually, in my book, there is a chapter about how dibao families spend their welfare money. And not only do they spend the money on medical care, they also spend money on children's education. So for both of these, that's a positive finding, that many families prioritize what I call human capital investment for health and education. At the same time, that also showcases the lack or insufficiency of healthcare and education benefits or mechanisms for these low-income families. So I think we need to not only strengthen the dibao, but also strengthen the healthcare and education systems for all people, but especially families in need.
So you also have written that might be more isolated than their peers, even of equivalent and income status. So what about the dibao itself makes these particular recipients more isolated than others?
This goes back to your previous question about stigmatization. And I think it's very much a fact that's not researched about in the dibao literature, as well as in the welfare literature in other countries. Mostly researchers and officials pay attention to their economic well-being, income, consumption, poverty status, even assets, but not a lot of attention has been paid to their subjective well-being or social participation. I think that's very important. And in the book, I devote one chapter to that. We do see that dibao recipients tend to be more isolated, less active in their social participation. For example, participating in neighborhood exercise groups or going to a movie theater. I also provide some evidence using time use data that dibao recipients, when compared to their peers who are also low income, tend to spend less time on leisure and social activities. I think that will be a challenge and a concern as we move forward with China's welfare program, in particular the dibao, but also other social assistance programs, because people increasingly have subjective or social or spiritual needs. For example, I cite quantitative interview data where one dibao recipient says, we want to go to a museum, we want to go see a movie, but that's not a culturally acceptable use of the dibao income. So I think this will need to be researched more and also discussed in the policy debate, right? What is considered poverty and what are considered essential needs to be addressed by such cash transfer programs.
I wanted to ask about China's cultural attitude toward welfare. Had a lot of people who complain about bulao or huo, and so I'm wondering, what is the cultural attitude towards something like dibao?
Right, it's a very relevant topic for our conversation in particular, because when we talk about dibao and the stigma and expectation for work and earning your income, meanwhile, when we think about guaranteed income, right? In China, traditionally, as I mentioned in the opening chapter of my book, people expect other members of society to earn a living through their own work or through their family and community support. But as we have seen, as China's economy transitioned from the planned economy to the market economy, there are many people who cannot support themselves through the market economy, whether it's because of their education or skills, or whether it's because they need to support their family members who are older or who have illnesses that need them to be there to offer care. So that will continue. I think there will be some attitude shifts. In the early 1990s, the Chinese society already went through attitude shift. Previously, people had guaranteed jobs, but many people during the economic transformation were laid off. So able-bodied adults couldn't support themselves through jobs anymore. And that's right now, that group is making up about half of the dibao population. And we will continue to struggle with this dilemma, right? Whether to support this group of population with dibao, with a cash transfer. I think the society will need to face that challenge. I also want to say that I now live in the US, and I've seen a parallel debate. The American society also shares a lot of similar debates: who is deserving, who is not deserving of government support. And they also value work and independence, as many other societies do. But there will always be people who need the support, regardless of their workability or age or physical conditions. So I agree with you. This is an important topic going forward for dibao and for other welfare programs in China and in other countries.
And in China, what percentage of people in poverty actually receive the dibao?
So poverty right now, I mean, it's hard to define exactly depending on the poverty line you use. you have different definitions of poverty. In urban areas, right now, the dibao line is mostly treated as the urban poverty line, which varies by city. There are a lot of research about dibao's targeting effectiveness. That is, how many people or what proportion of those who qualify for dibao can get it, and how many who don't qualify according to the standard actually can benefit from it. There are quite some targeting errors, partly because it's hard to target people, partly because of misreporting or difficulty to capture the real income or asset situation. In rural areas, targeting is even harder because of the fluctuation in a family's income situation and job situation. So targeting error is real, and local officials are very aware of it. But that will stay with the program because of the variations of family conditions and income.
How much does an average dibao family actually receive?
Wow, that's a good question. Again, it varies quite a bit depending on where you live and whether you are in an urban or rural area. In the book, I have graphs to show there are huge variations across urban and rural areas, and even within a certain province, across cities, across localities, there are variations. So a national average number exists, but it doesn't tell us a lot about the actual benefit level. Because dibao benefits are established according to the local economic conditions and consumption level.
And for example, for a larger family, my understanding is that each person gets an additional boost onto the household income. So if you have 3 people in your family, then the total household income has to meet 3 times the actual dibao.
That is correct. So even though dibao, often we think of it as a family level or household level program, it's really individual based. So the application is based on individual conditions. Within a family, it could be that one person qualifies or 2 people qualify, and the benefits that each individual are entitled would also vary according to your income level, work ability, whether you're a child or older person.
And so there's a lot of other welfare programs in China that are tied to qualifying for the dibao. I'm also curious to know whether or not in certain areas, do you think that makes somewhat of a welfare cliff, that if you lose dibao, you lose all of these particular benefits, and it might even be worse than working if you lose all of those benefits in one fell swoop?
That is true. That I think is one of the policy design features of dibao that needs to be revised. Right now, as you said, dibao serves as a gatekeeper for a series of other social assistance programs. Those include medical assistance, education, housing, even a temporary relief program. So if you qualify for dibao, you automatically enter the possible pool for consideration in getting the other benefits. And many dibao families, maybe they could get off dibao, but they cannot afford to get off other benefits, especially education and medical care. So dibao serving as this gatekeeper role I think for administration purposes, makes things easier, but brings a lot of other questions, other problems. So I think it should be reconsidered and revised.
Another area that I've seen some criticism of dibao is that certain officials might use it to strengthen their authority, or maybe they'll use it to provide dibao benefits to people that do what they prefer they do, or maybe they're people that they're connected with. Do you see corruption as a large issue, and do you think officials use the dibao to strengthen their authority?
There certainly have been reported cases, especially in recent years through media. There are corruption cases tied to dibao that have been exposed. It's true, especially in rural areas where dibao is hard to be monitored. There are cases of giving dibao to relatives or personal connections of local officials. The central government realized this, partly thanks to the media exposure of these stories. In 2012 and 2013, there were some new regulations to make sure corruption would not be so prominent in dibao cases. So one measure that was implemented was the county level officials need to monitor and verify dibao eligibility, which previously was overseen by township or village level. So there are measures that are taken to address this, and coupled with the anti-corruption campaign, I think this will be happening less and less, hopefully, but it's always need to be cautioned that it could happen.
And do you have a percentage in mind when how much does the dibao actually lower poverty in China? I know that there's been more emphasis on that it addresses the depth of poverty, but how much does dibao actually lower poverty in China?
Mm-hmm. So again, in the book, I have one chapter that's devoted to how dibao is effective or not in reducing poverty. And I do differentiate the poverty rate, poverty depth, and poverty severity. One finding that's consistent across different studies is that poverty has been reduced by dibao, probably not entirely, but certainly to a modest degree. And among the three measures of poverty, poverty severity and poverty depth have been reduced more than the poverty rate. I hesitate to offer a certain number because, as you have seen in the book, depending on the poverty line we use, the reductions could vary. But the overall picture is dibao helped to reduce poverty, and especially the depth and the severity of poverty.
So the last question that I want to get into, and it's my the area that I'm interested in researching, is the benefits and drawbacks of universalizing the dibao, and by that I mean removing all the means tests. Do you think that any feasibility of doing that in a place like China, and if it were to be done, how would you actually see that going about?
That's again a great question, and a question very much on my mind recently. China is so big, as you well know, and the development across China is quite uneven. I think the best possibility probably would be for certain more developed localities to experiment with such a program and see how it works. To make dibao or a similar cash transfer program to be universal all around China, I don't think is very likely in the short term. both in terms of physical challenges and also political and cultural challenges. But I also just read in this network, Shenzhen is going to experiment with the Sharing Shenzhen initiative, where every citizen of Shenzhen could receive a guaranteed income. So maybe some localities will experiment and we will gain evidence from these experiments.
Well, it's really exciting to hear that you are reading from Bien, and I want to get into more about universalizing the dibao possibly next time if you would be able to join us, because I think that is an important question, and I think China is an important area to experiment with the idea of a guaranteed income, because as far as I know, implementation has been done on this question in the Asia Pacific region. So I think it's sort of overlooked when it comes to basic income research. So that's why I'm really excited to get to talk to you today about the dibao.
Thank you. At the same time, China right now, as you probably are aware, has launched this targeted anti-poverty initiative, 精准扶贫 in Chinese. And some features of that initiative is to give a fixed amount of income or subsidy for local citizens who are poor. So it's still means tested, but it's a different feature than the dibao, than a typical welfare program. I'm following that development, and very much also I'm interested in the guaranteed income movement. So hopefully we can talk again in the future.
All right, well, Dr. Qin Gao, this was really awesome to get to hear your expertise on the dibao. This is something that I've been really interested in studying for quite a while now. So I hope I get to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much.